Howdy folks, welcome to another edition of Diary of the Deadpit. I am Uncle Bill, and last week I did a franchise edition of the show on the Nightmare on Elm Street series, featuring, of course, Robert Englund and directed by Wes Craven and a lot of those films. But this week I thought it would be a good idea, since it is Friday the 13th, to do the entire franchise of Friday the 13th films. So we're going to be going through all those films plus a little bit more too. I've got a couple of added surprises that I thought I'd spring on everybody. But up first, I want everybody to take note that this poster in the background over here should be a reminder to everybody that our Friday the 13th show is already up, should already be up, with Friday the 13th Part 5 alumni, director Danny Steinman and Junior from the film, Ron Sloan, are both going to be on the show. We got interviews with both of them. It's pretty epic because Danny Steinman, I don't think, has ever done an audio interview, and I know Ron Sloan's never done an interview of any kind. As a matter of fact, he was never even in the book that I'm getting ready to talk about here in a minute. And this book is comprehensive as hell. So I guess this would be a good way to start off the show, though. This is not only the films, but I'm also going to be talking about some of the merchandise and some of the memorabilia that you can get for Friday the 13th. And if you don't have this item I'm getting ready to show you, you're really not a Friday the 13th fan. It is the most comprehensive horror book I've ever read. It has to do with any series, except for maybe those damn Tim Lucas books. And that's just on like Bava films and Argento films. Now this is Crystal Lake Memories, the book by Peter Bracke. Some of the bitch is heavy too. If you don't have this film, it's about the size of a coffee table, and it's just an awesome retrospective of all the Friday the 13th films. I think it even includes Freddy vs. Jason. It's got some amazing pics in the film. And look at that, I opened right up to Part 5. Isn't that amazing? With Bob DeSimone there. That's Tom DeSimone's brother. He's in Friday 5. Tom DeSimone directed Hell Night, and he also directed Reform Schoolgirls. But I digress. It's got, check out the cool back. It's got the Jasons throughout the years. You know, Ari Lehman there, and I believe the second one, is that Tom Morga, or is that, no, that wouldn't be Tom Morga. That is Richard Brooker on the second one, and then you go, of course, Kane Hodder with Slimy Jason, and then Jason X. But Crystal Lake Memories, this is a second printing. I think the first printing went out of print like almost immediately. There's a couple of editions of this book that are signed by a ton of people that he got to participate in the book, and that thing goes for a couple of $100. You can get this just about anywhere now, though. I highly recommend it. And you gotta have one of these. When you're a kid and you're going trick-or-treating and you go out and you, at one time or another, in the 80s at least, when I was a kid, you had to dress up like Jason Voorhees. That was like mandatory. You got one of them shitty plastic masks that was completely white. It didn't age or anything. It just looked like you bought it right off the shelf, which you did. But it had no bearing on the Friday the 13th films. But everybody had those, and the plastic machetes that you carried around and stuff. And I got this little ditty at the Horrifying Weekend in Baltimore, Maryland, 2004. I'm guessing that they're trying to replicate the Friday 7th mask, because it's got the big chunk. Got the big chunk taken out right here. But it's really like an amalgamation. It's not a true rendering of any of the masks. But it is, in fact, signed by Kane Hodder, who plays Jason in parts 7 through 10. Unfortunately, did not get picked up for the Freddy vs. Jason film, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in this. But I got the last one that they had, and I got it because I knew I was going to get it signed by Kane Hodder, and I wanted to definitely get a mask signed by him. So it doesn't have a strap on it, and I just leave it hanging in the room because it looks really cool, and it usually frightens people. That, along with Eugene over there, which is of course my giant bust from the Rage film, that scares the shit out of people because it looks like a real person. And so people walk by it and are frightened all the time. So let's move on with the films. And before I get started with this, I just want everybody to know that I have a couple of the single disc versions of this film, and I have a really amazing story about how I got the box set from Crystal Lake to Manhattan, the Friday the 13th box set that goes from 1 to 8. So we'll just go ahead and get started with that. And first up on the big Friday the 13th special countdown is the original Friday the 13th. And you can see that my edition of Friday the 13th is signed by Victor Miller, who is, of course, the writer. He was a big-time sitcom writer before this. And the original film is pretty much unlike any of the other films that followed it in a lot of ways that I don't want to spoil for anybody who hasn't seen the film, but not only in the way that the ending is revealed, and you don't really see the killer up until like the last reel of the film, but also because it was shot with sort of like an exploitation, really cheap feel that Sean Cunningham was coming off of Last House on the Left and Manny's Orphans and these really low budget films, especially Last House on the Left, and he just made a film that looked really gritty, and it kind of had a grindhouse style to it, and it was some of Tom Savini's early work where he made that year. He made like The Prowler, and The Burning was the next year. He made Friday the 13th Maniac, like all these great gore scenes right in a row. He made them all right on the time he made Friday the 13th. And Friday the 13th is a story of a group of camp counselors that are up on Camp Crystal Lake, and they start getting systematically picked off one by one by a killer who you never see, much like Halloween, which is what Victor Miller was trying to copy in this film. You get the point of view shots of the killer, but you never actually see the killer. So up until the final reel, and then there's like a huge surprise. And another notable thing about this movie is this is not the first movie I saw. I didn't see these in order. I think the first one that I saw was either 3 or 4, and I went back and watched this one and was kind of disappointed in it until I got a little bit older, because you don't understand that it doesn't have Jason in it per se. It does, but he's not the killer in the film. So you have to kind of, I don't know, it doesn't have that 80s cheese factor. It's much more of like a murder mystery film than the rest of them turned out to be. And there's like 3 different freaking endings to this movie too. I think they tacked on one of the endings in like post. You get the feeling when you watch it that in post-production they tacked on one of these endings because they knew it would scare the piss out of the audience. And then the other one they tacked on to make room for a sequel, because I think they realized that they were on something here too. But Friday the 13th is, if I was going to put these all in order, it's like in the top, it's got to be in the top 3 or 4. I don't consider it to be the best Friday film. It's got a lot of flaws to it, especially some of the dialogue and just the expendable nature of the characters. But what the hell Friday film doesn't have that, really? So that's Friday the 13th, and that's one of the only single disc versions that I have. We'll get into another one here in a second. I just thought it would be a better visual aid. But I've also got the box set, of course, like I said, and it's a really interesting story because we're going to get into part 2 about how it is that I got this box set. If you see it on there, you see it signed, Aaron, thanks for watching, all my best, Tom McLaughlin. Tom McLaughlin is the director of Part 6, and I had a chance to write to him and correspond with him over a period of a couple of weeks, and I just told him how much that I really liked Part 6, and the guy literally just packed up the entire box set, put it in the envelope that I sent with mine, which was like a manila envelope, so it was like busting out of the sides when I got it, signed this and signed his disc, which I'll show here in a minute, and sent it back to me, and I was like, what the I'm glad I never bought it, because it's pretty amazing that the guy would send me the entire box set. But a lot of fans bitch about this box set, and I'm kind of one of them too, because really it's got a couple of commentaries on it, and one of them is by Tom McLaughlin, amazingly, but and like a special features disc, but it doesn't have any of the extended cuts of the film. Like there's supposed to be tons of scenes cut out of the film from the gore shots that the MPAA cut, and there's other versions of Friday the 13th in Britain. I think there's a version that's like a Region 2 version that's got a commentary by Sean Cunningham that's not on here. It's just Paramount's one of those companies that they don't really take advantage of their horror titles the way that they should. But here's the Friday the 13th 2, and the one thing I know about Friday the 13th Part 2 is Amy Steele is hotter than shit in that movie. Now, Amy Steele was in April Fool's Day, too. She plays Jenny, the lead heroine in the film. And, my God, I don't know what it was with that period of time, but she was absolutely one of the hottest women alive. Directed by Steve Miner, who directed Part 3 as well. He also directed House. He's like a really, really good horror director. Unfortunately, he made the epic piece of shit Day of the Dead remake here recently. but he was really good. And this one is the first time you actually get to see Jason, but it's not the Jason like you remember. It's Tater Sack Jason. And Tater Sack Jason is exactly what it sounds like. It's a big dude with a tater sack on his head, no mask yet. That doesn't come up until the next movie, which I'll be talking about. But he terrorizes the kids at Camp Crystal Lake again as they come back. This is one of those films that's got the campfire scene in it where they're telling the backstory. It's also got one of the best endings of any of the Friday the 13th movies. I think probably the best ending for me, in which Jenny in the film dresses up like Mrs. Voorhees and tries to trick Jason into thinking that it's her. And it's just a really cool film. Not my favorite of the series. The death scenes in it leave a lot to be desired, and the characters aren't really that memorable, but the ending alone is worth the film. And we actually got to talk to Amy Steele. We interviewed her on one of the past Friday the 13th retrospectives. So, moving on, Friday the 13th Part 3 and Friday the 13th Part 4. Friday the 13th Part 3 was in 3D, and I've never actually had a chance to see the film in 3D, but I would love to eventually. It was actually the good 3D. There's like two different kinds of 3D. There's a kind that Freddy's Dead was filmed in, which is really shitty and you can barely see it, and there's a kind that was used in theaters around that time, like Jaws 3D and Friday the 13th 3D. Really good. Has the first appearance of the Mask, which is brought in by Larry Zerner, who is Shelley in the film, who's like a practical jokester who carries around a bunch of equipment to trick people. One of them happens to be a hockey mask, and so you get to see, the first real Jason as we know him. And Richard Brooker plays Jason in the film, and he's one of the best Jasons because I think he was a trapeze artist and an acrobat too, so he really moves well, and he's a huge guy. He's like 6'3", and just moves well. You could kind of see him being a killer. In Part 2, it was Steve Dash, who, there's a big controversy because Warrington Gillette actually claimed to be the real Jason in the film for a lot of years, and then it turns out it was mostly a stuntman named Steve Dash who was the Jason in that film. In this one, it's definitely just Richard Brooker. And in this one, there's no real big difference. They just go back to Camp Crystal Lake. On this edition, though, it's actually got a select cast and crew commentary on Part 3. They go back to Camp Crystal Lake. The lead in the film, I guess, is Paul Kratka, and Dana Kimmel is like one of the other leads in the film. And from what I remember, it's your basic like stalk and slash movie from there on out. Larry Zerner's a pretty memorable character. It's got like a Cheech and Chong ripoff guy, looks like Tommy Chong, and there's some good death scenes in it though. There's an amazing like eye-popping scene and a spear scene that was shot in 3D where a woman gets a spear in the eye. Anyway, got to move on to Part 4, the final chapter, which they brought Tom Savini back in this one. Savini was the makeup guy in Part 1, and they told him that if he killed all, or he said they told him that he could come back, and his only requirement was he got to kill off Jason. So of course it's called the final chapter, and he thought he was going to kill Jason off. The producers actually thought they were going to kill Jason off, but money talks, folks. And this movie made a lot of money. Joseph Zito behind the camera, so they went back and did another one, which was Part 5. But in this one, you got the introduction of Tommy Jarvis, which would be one of the only reoccurring characters in the whole series, who played by Corey Feldman. And he's like a little kid that's supposed to be like kind of like Tom Savini's child form, in that he collects masks and makes these different masks and does special effects and stuff like that. And they're all up on Camp Crystal Lake, and one by one they start getting picked off. And Crispin Glover's in this one too, which is really weird. He's got one of the better death scenes in the film, and the makeup effects in it are freaking amazing. Like I remember when I saw the first the fourth one the first time, it was the opening scene where the coroner guy gets like a hacksaw to the neck, then he gets his head twisted around. That's some of the goriest stuff I'd ever seen at that time, and it's just great. But it does introduce Tommy Jarvis. The ending of it's really great for like PTSD survivor types. One of the better ones, I would put that one probably in the top 3 of the way that I order them. The next one I would put as number 1, and a lot of people don't believe it because it is the most despised one. But you got Friday the 13th Part 5, and you can see Tom McLaughlin signed it right there on his film Jason Lives. Friday 5 is the most misunderstood of the series because fans hate it, because of one particular thing about it that I don't want to ruin for everybody, but it's not exactly like the rest of the Friday the 13th films, but it's a fucking slasher film, man. I mean, seriously, if you're going to get all picky about that kind of stuff, you really don't need to be watching horror films because they don't have any plot or relevance to them anyway, most of the time. I mean, especially films of the 80s like this. In Friday 5, they kind of shift from Camp Crystal Lake to everybody goes to this asylum where Tommy Jarvis is now grown up and he's morphed from Corey Feldman to John Shepard this time. And he's mentally disturbed and he's got all kinds of problems because of what happened in part 4. So he's at an insane asylum and he meets all these wonderful people like Reggie and Violet and Joey and all these people. And there's a couple of different things going on here because there's a killing that's not involving Jason, which has to be one of the first in the series, in which Mark Venturini kills Dominic Brascia, who plays Joey in the film, with an axe, because Joey's this really annoying, like, overweight character that's always going around like trying to help out people, and he screws everything up. So it's got one of the best lines too, where he's always like, "Well, fine, Vic, but I think you're way out of line," and then you get to see it if you see the film. Directed by Danny Steinman, and the Jason in this one was Tom Morga, who's like a veteran stunt man. He's done a ton of stuff for Halloween. I think he's one of the only guys that's ever been in Friday the 13th, Halloween, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series as some kind of a stunt person as well. But it's really the sleaziest film of the bunch. Tons of nudity, graphic violence, and they censored out a ton of violence, probably more in that one than in any other film except part 7. But to my mind, it really is the best of the series. And then part 6, completely different direction, man. Like Tom McLaughlin, I love the guy. It's just, the film went from like sleazy kind of porn style film, because Danny Steinman directed Savage Streets too, so you kind of get an idea where that one's going, to like a fantasy epic kind of Jason movie with Jason Lives, in which Jason is brought back to life. In this reincarnation, he's like the zombie Jason by a Tommy, this time played by Tom Matthews, who was in Return of the Living Dead and Return of the Living Dead 2. And in this one, he comes and he tries to dig up Jason and kill him, and he jams like a big steel fence post into him, which gets struck by lightning and brings him back to life. And now he's really fucking mad because he's like zombie Jason. As if he wasn't bad enough before, now he's a reincarnated, pissed off Jason. And it's got Horshack in it as well. And the cast of characters in this one is not as memorable to me as part 5 or part 4. It's got a bunch of expendable characters, and the female lead in the film really didn't do that much for me either. But it's excellent direction in the film, and like a lot of humor and a nod to the old style, like classic 30s and 40s movies. The direction is just top notch, and McLaughlin's great in it, or not great in it, but a great director, and he does some good stuff with it. And it kind of took it away from the exploitation ground that it was going on in part 5, and gave it a little bit of credibility, I think. So from there you go on to part 7, and part 7 is, in my mind, the best one for practical makeup, costumes, and effects and shit. John Carl Buechler directed this, and we've had him on the show as well. A genius when it comes to sculpting. I don't think anybody could ever forget the Jason in Friday Part 7, which is like, he's got his spinal cord exposed, half the mask is kind of... It really is like he took all the things that were supposed to happen to Jason and made them real. Like in part 6, Jason's been through a lot of shit, but you could never really tell it in part 6 because the guy that was playing him and stuff, there's like a bunch of problems with the Jason character in the film. And C.J. Graham is the guy that played him in that one, and it's just basically like a black looking Jason and a mask that looks perfectly fine. And this one, he's tore all to hell. Like, he looks like he's really been put through the ringer. And this is the Carrie versus Jason one, where you got the chick who has telekinetic powers. I'm trying to remember her name. Laura Park Lincoln, who we've actually tried to get on the show, haven't had a chance to yet. But she's got telekinetic powers, and she kind of uses them to battle Jason at the end of the film. So it is very much like a fantasy, Carrie-esque type Jason film. Some great death scenes, though. John Carl Buechler is amazing with the makeup, like I said. A new Jason, which is Kane Hodder, who would go on to be the guy representing Jason, even though he probably won't be representing him in the new film, the new remake that's coming out. That's going to be Derek Mears, and he wasn't in Freddy vs. Jason, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But Part 8, transitioning because I'm trying to keep this rolling, Part 8 is Jason Takes Manhattan, which really should have been called Jason Takes a Cruiser, or a Cruise Line, and then Jason Takes Manhattan for about 5 minutes. Because they didn't have a lot of time to spend in New York, so most of this film is shot by Rob Hedden, or Hedden, how you pronounce his name, is shot on a cruiser, like a cruise line ship, a big yacht type of ship, and that's where most of the killings take place. Notable in this film is really bad makeup. I'm fucking sorry, but the makeup in this film almost takes me out of the film, especially towards the end when you actually get to see Jason unmask again, and to see him unmask in Part 7 and how awesome that was, and then in this one where he looks like Play-Doh and fucking like white clay, it's just a really bad Halloween mask. Whoever did the effects of this movie should really be ashamed. But it was the last Friday the 13th film that had that type of plot where it was just Jason and a group of kids. He starts killing them off, and it had that feel that it was the same as the rest of Friday the 13th. And when it gets to New York, it actually picks up a little bit and gets a little bit better up until the very end. I mean, there were a lot of stuff in the film, and it's the first appearance of Ken Kersinger in the films too, who plays the cook, who Kane Hodder actually, as Jason, throws over the counter when they actually make it to New York. A lot of things about this film, though. Don't have time to get into all of them. It is the last film that I truly believe is part of that classic era of Friday the 13th films. Before we get to the next one, but the next one actually does still have Kane Hodder playing Jason in it, and I've got the single disc version of this one. It's Jason Goes to Hell, which I've never opened, by the way. It was on television a while back, and I watched it again. This has got the unrated version. Most notable to me because Jason's really not in this film. If you like Friday the 13th films, you'll probably hate this because Jason, I know people say that about Friday the 13th 5, but in this film it's really a lot worse because in that film it really was Jason. I'm sorry, it was. I mean, there was a guy dressed up as Jason, so it's basically him. In this one, it's just a bunch of different people because Jason gets blown up in the beginning of the film. Everybody thinks he's dead for sure, and then he's got a heart which for some reason makes fucking people go insane and suck the juice out of his heart, which then infects them in kind of like a Night of the Creeps-esque sort of way where it takes over their body and they become Jason. So it's just like a bunch of random strangers that are supposed to be Jason, but they're just regular actors, so it's really not that entertaining. It does have, in my opinion, the best kill in any of the Friday the 13th films, which you can only see on the unrated version of the film, which is where Jason busts in on the couple having sex and sticks like the spear into the woman and splits her completely down the middle. I believe this is K&B effects. I'm pretty sure it is. And yeah, it is. And that's some of the best special effects that I've ever seen. That is like practical makeup effects, but the way it was cut and the way that it was shot, it blew me away. I mean, it's one of the best effects going. But it's directed by Adam Marcus. It has the guy in it, I'm trying to remember his name. He was in the X-Files too. He played X, which was like Deep Throat's replacement in the film. I can't remember the guy's name. Steve Williams. Yeah, that's his name. Steve Williams, who's like the bounty hunter guy in the film. He's trying to track down Jason. It's kind of okay, but it's one of those films where the death scenes are the only thing going for it. Like, you can't pay attention to the plot whatsoever because it's just horrendous. And it doesn't really have Jason in it except for the opening and the end of the film, which is really bad in and of itself. But another thing that it does have going for it, though, if you're a fan of the Friday the 13th series, it's got the guy, and I forget his name, who was one of the leads in the series, is actually the star of this film too. So, moving on to Jason X. I don't have Jason X. I'm one of those people that if I don't like a film, I don't fucking buy it. I don't care. I'm not a completist type of person. I don't have to have the whole series. I didn't like that film. In my mind, that is the worst film of the series. I don't know. it's very Canadian. It was filmed in Canada. It has that Canadian look to it. The death scenes in it are fucking horrible, and I like the mask design and everything for Jason, all right, the new like RoboCop mask design or whatever, but he doesn't. It's just not Jason anymore. I mean, in this one, he's cryogenically frozen, brought back to life, and gets like an upgrade to his suit where he's basically impervious to everything. Which, okay, you're going in a different direction. But anytime you send anybody up into space, in the future into space, the franchise is fucked. It just is. Like any Leprechaun in the hood or Leprechaun in space, just stop making them. Hellraiser, the one they sent him up in space, just stop. You know it's fucked if they send you up in space, and in this one it definitely was. Although this was the last one to have Kane Hodder in it, because up next you've got this thing, which is Freddy vs. Jason, which they picked up Ken Kersinger, who was, like I mentioned before, basically a stuntman who Kane Hodder trained to do stunts and stuff, and he was in Friday the 13th Part 8. Freddy vs. Jason is one of the worst plots. It's just one of the most convoluted films that there could ever be. And the thing that sucks about it is it went through like a dozen script rewrites, and a dozen different writers wrote it, and this is the one they picked. Like, I would hate to see some of the shit they turned down if this is the one they picked to be like the main script for this film. Basically, Freddy's the star of the film. It's really not a Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street film. It's not like any of the other franchises, although they try to put elements of both in it, where I can't even explain it to you, really. It would take 20 minutes to explain the film, but Freddy is controlling Jason in the film, and there's a group of kids that still live on Elm Street who they keep like hidden in these chambers, and they don't allow them to have nightmares and all this stuff. They're basically keeping Freddy at bay, but he gets into Jason, starts to control his dreams, which in turn controls him till the very end of the film, where there's like a huge battle between Freddy and Jason. And of course it sucks, because nobody can win the battle. I mean, they got these huge franchises, they want to make a sequel to it. Nobody's going to release the rights to have like a franchise hero killed on film. It just doesn't going to work, so the movie ends up suffering and sucking because of it. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed this. It took 27 minutes, but there's a lot of films. I tried to go through them as best I could, as quickly as I could. So that's the Friday the 13th special. Check us out on Deadpit.com. We got the Friday the 13th 5 special, should be up by now, with Danny Steinman and Ron Sloan, who plays Junior. There's a Friday the 13th commentary that we did. You can play it over your DVDs. Be sure to check all this shit out. I'm Uncle Bill. Peace. Word out. Deadpit.com.